Hey class, so today we're going to talk about chapter 22. This is talking about gas exchange and our respiratory system. So the main topics that we'll cover are how gas exchange takes place in organisms. We'll take a look at the human respiratory system and how gases are transported in the human body. So when we talk about gas exchange, this involves a multitude of steps. So this includes our breathing, and then also how gases are transported into our tissues and in how gases are exchanged with the body's cells and tissues. So the interchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide happens between the organism and its environment. And this provides oxygen for our cells to be able to do their respiration, and the waste product of respiration is carbon dioxide. So gas exchanges also includes the removal of carbon dioxide from our cells and tissues. So this happens in three phases of gas. Gas exchange happens in three phases in humans and other animals that have lungs. So first, we breathe in oxygen from the atmosphere, and then the second step is that that oxygen is transported by the circulatory system, and then finally there's an exchange of gases with the body cells. Body tissues take up oxygen from the blood and they release carbon dioxide back into the blood. That blood is transferred back to the lungs, where we can respire the carbon dioxide back out. So in order for gas exchange to be efficient, respiratory surfaces must be thin and moist so that oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse across the surface. In some animals, like this worm, that means it's the entire skin is the gas exchange organ, but most organisms have some kind of gills or tracheal systems, like in mammals. And so the gills in fish and other aquatic organisms is where that oxygen exchange takes place. And then the capillaries within the lungs of lunged animals, that's where that gas exchange occurs. So the way gills work, they absorb oxygen that's dissolved in the water. And in a fish, that gas exchange is, it happens, it's enhanced by the flow of water over the respiratory organ. So it actually, the fish is actually taking water into its mouth. It pushes that water over its gills, and that's how the gas exchange takes place. But animals with lungs have two big advantages to the ability to breathe air. One is that air has a much higher concentration of oxygen, available oxygen, than water does, and it's also much lighter and easier to move, so it takes a whole lot less energy to actually just get the oxygen into your tissues. So insects have a tracheal system, which allows for direct exchange between the air and the body cells. So the respiratory surfaces of the tracheal system of insects has these tiny branching tubes inside the body, which transport oxygen directly to blood cells and move carbon dioxide away from them. And this is really important because it reduces the amount of water that's lost in the process. So the colonization of land by vertebrates was one of the milestones in the history of evolution. So what we've seen is that the evolution of legs from legs on land animals evolved from fins. And that's a pretty obvious body design change in the fossil record. But the refinement of lungs and lung breathing was extremely important in this evolutionary process that allowed organisms to begin to walk on land. So paleontologists have uncovered a lot of different types of transitional forms of this evolution. And they actually jokingly refer to them as fishopods. So they're fish-like, but they are also arthropod-like. So the adaptations for air breathing became evident in these fossils because we see things like this flat skull with long elongated snout and a muscular neck and shoulders that enabled the animal to lift its head clear out of the water to support air breathing. Okay, so moving on to the human respiratory system. So in mammals, we have these branching tubes that convey the air to the lungs that are located in a chest cavity. So this diaphragm is the tissue that separates the abdominal cavity from this, what we call the thoracic cavity, so the lung cavity. So in mammals, air is inhaled through the nostrils into the nasal cavity. There are hairs within the nasal cavity that help to filter out any foreign objects, and also there are mucus surfaces that keep the airway nice and moist. The air is warmed and humidified and sampled for odors, and that inhaled air then passes through the pharynx, so this into the esophagus in your throat, the larynx and trachea and bronchi into the bronchioles and the bronchial tubes, and into the alveoli. So the alveoli are these little tiny blood vessels at the ends of your bronchioles in your lungs, and that they are these tiny little capillaries where most of the oxygen exchange takes place. So our breathing is actually driven by what we call negative pressure. So negative pressure breathing is what ventilates your lungs. So when we say breathing, what breathing means is the ventilation of the lungs through alternating inhalation and exhalation. We don't think much about this. This is mostly an involuntary response that we do. We certainly can, hold our breath and increase our breathing and things like that. But for the most part, we breathe without really thinking about it. It's an involuntary response. But in humans and other mammals, this ventilation occurs by, again, what we call this negative pressure breathing in a system which air is pulled into the lungs. And what happens, the contraction of the rib muscles and the diaphragm expands this thoracic cavity. So as we inhale, the lung cavity, the thoracic cavity is expanded, which reduces the air pressure in those little tiny alveoli, those little capillaries at the bottom of the lungs. Oops, sorry. So again, this negative pressure breathing, it creates that pressure gradient by changing the volume of the lungs. And as we exhale, that pressure is put back onto the alveoli. Okay, so as I mentioned, breathing is an automatic response. I'm not talking again about, holding your breath to get rid of the hiccups. This breathing control is centered in the brain, and your brain coordinates your breathing with your body's needs by sensing and responding to different pHs of the cerebrospinal fluid. And what that does is it indicates how much carbon dioxide is present in the blood. So this figure here illustrates how the brain, the medulla, which is a portion of the brain, how it regulates breathing responses and changes to this level of carbon dioxide, which changes the pH in the spinal fluid. So your normal blood pH is about 7.4. So we have this situation where we've got a normal blood pH. But say you're exercising vigorously, which makes your metabolism speed up, and your body's cells are then using more oxygen and generating more carbon dioxide. So we have these rising levels of CO2 in our tissues. And that higher concentration of carbon dioxide leads to an increase in the hydrogen ions available, which lowers the pH of the blood and the spinal fluid. So what happens is these sensors in the major blood vessels detect this change, as well as in the brain. So the brain and the major blood vessels are detecting this decrease in blood pH. So as a response, the breathing control centers in the medulla respond by signaling the diaphragm and rib muscles to increase the rate and depth of the breathing. And thus the excess CO2 is expelled and the pH rises again to its normal blood pH. So that's how this response to increased carbon dioxide in the blood creates this respiratory response to restore that word that we keep coming back to, the homeostatic condition that we want to see in our blood. Okay, so let's talk about how gases actually, once, we've talked about how it gets into our lungs and out of our lungs, but what happens once it's in our body? We know that it needs to get throughout our tissues. So what happens is our blood, it transports all of the respiratory gases. So the heart is pumping oxygen poor blood, so we have the heart here in the middle, which is pumping oxygen poor blood, so this that's indicated in blue. It's rich in carbon dioxide. The heart pumps that carbon dioxide rich oxygen poor blood back to the lungs, where it picks up oxygen. The blood will pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide can be expelled. The oxygen is entering the lungs through inspiration or inhaled air. So the oxygen-rich blood then is pumped from the heart back to all of the major tissues and organs throughout the body, where that oxygen is consumed. It's used up by the tissues and by the cells. Cells generating carbon dioxide donate that carbon dioxide back to the blood, where it is again returned to the heart and is able to be pumped back up to the lungs to be exhaled back into the air, for carbon dioxide to be exhaled back into the air. So again, we have a mixture of gases in the air which exert this kind of pressure. And each kind of gas in a mixture counts for a portion of the total pressure. So each gas has what we refer to as a partial pressure. And different molecules of different kinds of gases diffuse down a gradient based on their own partial pressure. So they move from a region of higher partial pressure to lower partial pressure. And we have some illustrations here that I should be able to share with you.
As carbon dioxide is produced by cellular respiration in the cells, it diffuses into the interstitial fluid, through the capillary wall, and into the blood plasma. Some CO2 remains dissolved in the plasma, but most enters red blood cells. Some CO2 combines with hemoglobin. Most of the carbon dioxide, however, reacts with water to form carbonic acid, H2CO3. Carbonic acid breaks up to form a hydrogen ion, H+, and a bicarbonate ion, HCO3-. Hemoglobin picks up most of the hydrogen ions, preventing them from making the blood too acidic. The bicarbonate ions diffuse out of the red blood cell into the plasma. Oxygen-poor blood carrying carbon dioxide leaves the tissue capillaries and moves through blood vessels to the heart, where it is pumped to the alveolar capillaries of the lungs. When blood gets to the lungs, hemoglobin gives up its carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions. Bicarbonate combines with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, which is then converted back into carbon dioxide and water. Carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cell, out of the blood plasma, and into an alveolus in the lungs, where it is expelled with exhaled air. Let's start by looking at the movement of respiratory gases between blood and the body's tissue cells. Oxygen molecules are unloaded from hemoglobin, a protein in red blood cells. Oxygen diffuses into the blood plasma, through the capillary wall, into the interstitial fluid, and into cells, where it is used in cellular respiration. Meanwhile, oxygen from inhaled air diffuses out of the alveolus, into the blood plasma, and into the red blood cell, where it combines with hemoglobin. Oxygen-rich blood then leaves the alveolar capillaries and travels to the heart, where it is pumped through blood vessels to tissue capillaries. There, red blood cells deliver oxygen to tissue cells.
So in those videos, the narrator mentioned hemoglobin, and this is what we're talking about. This is a model of a hemoglobin pigment, and this is a red iron-containing pigment that's used by most vertebrates and also some invertebrates to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. And finally, in the human fetus, gas exchange occurs with the mother's blood. So this fetal hemoglobin attracts oxygen more strongly than adult hemoglobin does and enhances the oxygen transfer from maternal blood into the placenta. So at birth, what happens is the carbon dioxide level in the fetal blood rises, which stimulates the breathing control center in the to initiate breathing in the newborn. And that is the end. That's all that I have for this chapter 22. I hope everyone's doing well. Again, as always, please let me know if you have any questions.